Carl Paul Feyerabend's book against method. It's a very interesting book as far as how we can somehow scrutinize the very methodology, the scientific predominant scientific methodology, or overarching scientific method, which has been dominant in particular in scientific methodology, but that methodology has influences, or it has its overarching influence in other domains of human or other domains of knowledge as such. Before we are going to just discuss what the dialogue which Feyerabend wants to convey. Though there are two couple of facts that Feyerabend we have to also understand that the way Feyerabend doesn't critiques the dominant. He doesn't critique scientific method as such, but he critiques the categorification or pigeonholing of scientific method as if it is very much canonical or it's undisputed. So giving scientific method a sort of religiosity or a cover which will hide beneath it various uncomfortable facts, and which is not even which is somehow delimiting or it delimitating to the process of scientific methodology as such. Also, the motivations of critiquing a particular way of characterizing scientific methodology for Feyerabend has been personal, that he is feeling that this way of taking scientific methodology is somehow detrimental to the innateness, to the diversity of the varieties by which we can have, by which the criticality of rational method, which will be useful otherwise. So how he wants to convey his way of understanding methodology is that if I quote him, he says, for example, start of the book against method, what he says is that following essay is written in conviction that anarchism, while perhaps not the most attractive political philosophy, is certainly excellent medicine for epistemology and philosophy of science. So his philosophy of science is of the opinion, or it is converted to the belief that you should not have one method. There can be as many methods as possible, and which is good for the general methodology of how we can approach things or subjects, including scientific methodology, mainly scientific methodology. So even though in political sense that anarchy is always not, it's maybe for brief periods of revolutions, anarchy is normally tolerated, but as a human endeavor, we normally would seek stability and order. Although that stability and order should not have violence to it. In peace without justice can be violence without can be violent state of affairs, which might state anarchy for brief periods in the political history of mankind. Seeing things apart from that, but in scientific method, why is Feyerabend converted to this point of view? Why is anarchical, or anarchical maybe a more what I should say, in a negativistic sense, but I would say, why is Feyerabend open to all sorts of methodologies which may not necessarily stem from critical scientific rationalism? And even though scientific rationalism for him is not to be defined in the critical post-Renaissance materialistic interpretation of positivistic sense, in the sense in which the rationalism has been somehow very much influenced or taken from positivism, empiricism, materialism, or other ideologies, prevalent ideologies, which might have been cemented with a core which is undisputed scientific methodology. So the aim of this against method is basically to just do away with that consensus regarding scientific method. For example, when he says, when he quotes, for example, in page 10, when he quotes, to give his argument that, for example, he quotes Einstein, for example, when he says that the fact of experience, for a scientist, the facts of experience do not permit him to let himself to be too restricted in the construction of his conceptual world by adherence to an epistemological system. He therefore must be a systematic epistemologist, as a type of unscrupulous opportunists. So maybe the Einsteinian way of maybe unconscious effort of a scientist to unconscious way of trying to just go through the maze of data and get a clue of something original which will keep things in line. For Einstein, he might be so he can juggle here and there. He can be unscrupulous opportunist. So from being unscrupulous opportunist is on the one side, and from maybe also taking things from conservativistic, from even taking things which are not which are taking things from ideologies which have been repellent. Even the dominant modern scientific method has been, in a sense, a revolution. It's a sort of a departure against the medieval theological grounding of science. This is the way modern scientific empiricism has gone. But even Popper, he is open to both. He's open to being methodological opportunist, or even taking sometimes inspiration from conservative ideologies if it works. So anything which works. So in this milieu, what Popper is trying to, for example, he says it is in principle for all stage of for example, it will become clear that there is only one principle that can be defended under all circumstances and in all stages of human development. It is the principle anything goes, the abstract principle. Now so the principle is that anything goes, and abstract principle must be examined and explained in concrete detail. So this is the thing which is he's trying to expand in the rest of the book. So what I'm trying to say, I'll just try to read some of the paragraphs of this book and try to expand to my understanding what I have regarding the methodology of Feyerabend. For example, so he is, for example, when he says, so for him knowledge as such is not somehow, as we know also, it's not canonical, or it's not in a mosaic. It's a continuous what I should say, trespassing of ideas and frameworks, crisscrossing each other in all dimensions and directions. But what we normally called of, for example, knowledge. For example, what we call of knowledge is basically organized information, or there's a coherence to how we recognize what is knowledge, and not mere data or mere organized data is information, organized information is knowledge. So the coherence, so what he is saying that so he is open to the possibility of it is rather an ever increasing ocean of mutually incompatible alternatives. Each single theory, each fairy tale, each myth that's part of collection forcing the others into a greater articulation, and all of them contributing via this process of competition to the development of our consciousness. So he's open to knowledge being not merely coherent. There may be mutually coherent but incompatible parts in the building. It's not necessary that everything has to be coherent to be described as knowledge, because for example, it's not only a theory may clash with the evidence, not because it is correct, but the evidence is contaminated. So sometimes when we factualize a given when we have facts and we theorize, we just locate those facts within a given theory, but the theory has to somehow reproduce explain facts, but sometimes even facts can be contaminated. It's not that you have to theorize, you have to factualize, you have to theorize, you have to factualize your theory in that sense. So it's like, it's that even facts can be somehow not they can be sometimes discounted in facts, which is not the way we, in scientific methodology, facts are the essential ingredients, and the theory formulation and other things, they come later. So this is one important thing which Feyerabend is saying. For example, what he says, to just supplement it, that all methodologies, even the most obvious ones, have their limits. So for an anarchist, he might be like an undercover agent who plays the game of reason in order to cut the authority of reason. So this is his cut authority of reason. So otherwise also, for example, he says this dictum that what is compatible with science should survive, and what's not compatible with science, it should die. It smacks of chauvinism, or it smacks of something which Feyerabend is not comfortable with. So he in the process of, for example, there might not be, for example, people like Joseph Needham and other people, Bernal, there are maybe Dharmpal, there are many alternative views of doing science. So this universality of the science is universal, and there is no Western science, Chinese science, Indian science, Muslim science. Science as something uniquely, it's uniquely universal, hides beneath in it the thing that the practices of science, which there's some which might have arrived as a common heritage of mankind, there are elements of discord which ought to be at least recognized, which will just in later sentences is trying to expand in a better way. For example, when quoting, so if you study these, so there are various wonderful sentences. For example, when he quotes, for example, he says that perihelion of Mercury moves at the rate of 5,600 degrees per century. Of these values, 5,226 degree is the, you can account it for geometric reasons with reference to the reference frame, and rest 531 degrees are dynamical due to perturbations of the solar system. So of all these perturbations, the famous 43 degrees are accounted by classical mechanics. But this is how the situation is usually explained. Explanation shows that the premise from which we derive 43 degrees is not general theory of relativity plus suitable initial conditions. The premise contains classical physics in addition to whatever relativistic assumptions are made. For example, relativistic calculation, for example, Schwarzschild solution, maybe it does not deal with planetary system that exists in the real world, because Schwarzschild solution is a sort of centrally symmetrical universe containing singularity in the middle of it. So what are the reasons of employing such an odd conjunction of premises? So even when you go to the history of general theory of relativity in the 1919 expedition, what is normally quoted in the literature, the famous discovery of Eddington and other people in having that bending of light. So maybe there is also there is a program in science is also modified. You can modify classical mechanics and some additional principles, and you can also arrive at it. There are torsion theories of torsion. So there are various alternative theories which can also replicate Einsteinian result. The question he is asking is, why should this 43 degree, which is accounted by a peculiar understanding of general theory of relativity vis-a-vis classical mechanics, why did it somehow in popular literature got it just won the debate. It just won as an explanation as compared to the alternative explanations. So there is more to it. So that's what I thought. What she's trying to say. So the as if it is seen that there is the one methodologies are not written in stone. There is not one way of arriving at a certain thing, and that is not the only way. Which is so he is being uncomfortable with that. So it follows that the philosopher who wants to study the adequacy of science as a picture of the world, or who wants to build up a realistic scientific methodology, must look at modern science with special care. In modern science, science is more opaque. In most cases, modern science is more opaque and more deceptive than its 16th century, 17th century ancestors have been. So he is being repellent to the point of being what I should say, he's being very repellent to the point of critiquing the modern, the subterfuges of modern science, the way scientific enterprise, and compares it that the 16th century, 17th century thing was it's more subterfuges there. And further, for example, when he says the consideration of all these circumstances of terms, sensory core, auxiliary, background speculation suggests that in a theory may be inconsistent with evidence, not because it is incorrect, but because the evidence is contaminated. So that's it. What I was trying to say. What do you mean by history is this evidence is contaminated? So maybe there's a evidence, it's a partial evidence, or there's a fact, it's a fact, but it's conjuncted maybe with a larger fact, or there can be a theory. A theory may explain the given evidence, but there can be alternate theory which might not immediately explain that evidence, but it might explain that evidence in a the supposed contaminated evidence. It might not explain it, but it might be as much potent, or it might be as much thing valid. So we should not do away this thing. So for that, so what Popper, what this Feyerabend is trying to say is that um, how we can do away with these, how we can also just have this contaminated evidence, but which will militate how we mostly not theoretical sciences, mostly people who work in experimental sciences or methodological empirical sciences. For them, evidence is the prime facts or data is first thing they go for, then they go for theorization. For a theorist, maybe it may be relevant, but for a theorist of a certain kind, it may be acceptable. So what he says, therefore, the first step in our criticism of customary concepts and customary reactions is to step outside the step is again to therefore the first step in our criticism of customary steps and customary reaction is to step outside the circle and either to invent a conceptual system, for example in a theory that clashes with most successfully established observational results and confounds the most plausible theoretical principles, or to import such a system from outside science, from religion, from mythology, from ideas of incompetence or ramblings of madmen. This step is again counterinductive. Contradiction is both a fact science could not exist without, and legitimate and much needed move in the game of science. So what he is maybe Feyerabend is open to is sometimes being a counterinductive or counterintuitive in the sense that even you have not to totally rely on factualization of factualizing facts and theory-driven facts. So you can have theories which may not necessarily be fact-driven, but those theories may have just inspiration from maybe mythology, religion, and other schemes of. So for the healthy working of science, we should also take recourse to those alternative realizations or alternative experiences which have been existing there, which might not for an canonical, for a critical rationalist or a scientific empiricist, this thing is not it's not allowed. For example, in the history of sciences, the thought natural interpretations have been regarded either as a priori presentations of science or else prejudices, which must be removed before any serious examination can be begun with. So for this, so what I was trying to say, that even sometimes we can even discount facts. And why are critical rationalists or empirical rationalists will be very much repellent to this idea of being open to other things, is because of the way the Baconian interpretation of science, which is stems from scientific materialism and which has been very much influenced by this, how we critically localize or look the scientific empiricism. For example, when he says that in the fact that we do start even after Baconian analysis, therefore shows that the analysis has stopped prematurely. It has stopped at precisely those interpretations of which we are not aware and without which we cannot proceed. It follows that the intention to start from scratch after complete removal of all natural interpretation is self-defeating. So in the scheme of Bacon, in the scheme of scientific naturalism or scientific empiricism, we are going to discount any interpretation or any thing which is outside the scientific, outside the material causal domain, outside the Scientific empiricism. Empiricism is be all and the end all. You can start with empiricism and you can end at empiricism. So any empirical fact which might have inspiration from alternative theorizations, from mythology, from religion, from other ideologies, is discounted from the beginning. So somehow you can say that. So this is a critique of subtle critique of Bacon, or scientific methodology as it's been perceived in general science. So, for example, Galileo. So, in that he quotes, for example, the Galileo Copernican affair of why Galileo's interpretation has been taken as a thing that against church there are multiple layers and stories to it. So Galileo's thing has not been properly scrutinized. So Galileo's interpretation of things, it's not basically interpretation of science, or it's according to Feyerabend. He quotes, for example, in replacing the later by different interpretation. In other words, he introduced a new observation in language. Means what he wants to convey is that in the series of dialogues between church and Galileo was more sort of like in the dialogues of Plato. He is trying to argue or convince in a sort of rhetorical manner. The way even Galileo has introduced characters like Simplicio and Sagrado, and when he carefully analyzes those sentences, so the various sentences there, what Feyerabend tries to show is that the mode of writing of Galileo was more rather than convincing, rather than trying to be to promote a factual or a scientific or to promote a particular interpretation of science which is devoid of any, what I should say, motivations. So it's not that pure as it is seen in that church versus Galileo controversy. So he used, for example, he often used, for Galileo uses propaganda. So he has used, so what is common in how we see things. So he has a different interpretation to those events. For example, he quotes one of the sentences of Simplicio and Sagrado. Without experiment, I'm sure the effect will happen as I will tell you, because it must happen that way. And I might add that you yourself also know that it cannot happen otherwise, no matter how you may pretend not to know it. But I am not so handy at hand picking people's brain. I should make you confess this in spite of yourself. So it's more a rhetorical, the way a politician or a dramatist would try to convince you to his point of view, rather than as an act of pure scholarship. So, for example, for him, so Galileo invents an experience that has metaphysical ingredients. So, the whole dialogue of Galileo is not that pure, because that is taken as a cut point in the way we try to understand a scientific methodology. When we read in books that in science the authority, one humble reasoning is equivalent to the authority of 1,000 people. One humble argument is equivalent to the 1,000 authorities. So maybe this interpretation of Galileo, as far as Feyerabend goes, it doesn't hold. So here's again Galileo also. So in for example, now I'll come to what he is trying to say to one important thing which is very interesting thing, which is somehow which somehow will just it somehow will this sentence will just sum up of how what Feyerabend wants to convey his philosophy or his Weltanschauung, how it is to be seen, the whole enterprise of science or scientific methodology. So for him, so it's taken for granted by most logicians. It underlies the familiar distinction between context of discovery and context of justification. It's often expressed by saying that science deals with propositions and not with statements or science. However, so this is what he says, the procedure overlooks that science is a complex and heterogeneous historical process which contains vague and incoherent anticipations of future ideologies side by side with highly sophisticated theoretical systems and ancient and petrified forms of thoughts. Some of its elements are available in the form of neatly written sentences, while others are submerged and become known only by contrast, by comparison with new and unusual views. So the traditional or the canonical way by which we interpret scientific methodology as if it is written in rules, set rules which have been successful ever since and have been that way. The impression which we get by practicing scientists, theorists or experimentalists, which is being absorbed or internalized. So beneath there are various things which is amiss, that it's a historical process which contains vague and incoherent interpretations of future ideologies. It's not only the way we look at present, it's how we want to look towards future, or how we want to see the past, and from past we construct our present, or from future we construct our from our understanding of how we project future, and from that how we try to want to understand present, or how we understand past, and from that past how we want to understand our present. So these crisscrosses, these are things which you cannot mod out in the residual understanding of scientific discourse, which is there, which is part of it, but it's being left in the mainstream scientific understanding of things, how we pursue, or how scientific methodology is pursued. And further, for example, to just for example, when he says that this need to wait and ignore large masses of critical observations and measurements is hardly ever discussed in our methodologies. So when a scientist or invokes that we need to wait, or we need to ignore large amounts of critical observation measurement, is hardly ever discussed in our methodology, according to him. Maybe it's being discussed, but discussed I'll just disagree with this, that we discuss this thing, but if an empiricist is converted as a scientific, we discuss these things, but within the domain of scientific empiricism. The ideology is fixed. But if we just increase that sphere of methodology to include other ideologies, not only scientific, this materialism and empiricism, if it's not be all and end all, then we can the need to wait and ignore large amounts of critical observations and measurements is hardly ever discussed in our methodologies. Yeah, that's it. So within there is freedom, but within that materialistic scientific this empiricism, there might be freedom. But if you include ideologies in general, philosophies in general, and try to locate scientific methodology and scientific empirical methodology, so this stand might be so it's a point of view. For example, disregarding the possibility that a new physics or a new astronomy might have to be judged by a new theory of knowledge and might require entirely new tests, empirically inclined scientists at once confront it with status quo and announce triumphantly that it is not in agreement with facts and received principles. For at an early stage of development, that contradiction only indicates that old and the new are different and out of phase. It does not show which belief is the better one. A judgment of this kind presupposes that competitors confront each other on equal terms. How shall we proceed in order to bring out such a fair comparison? So this is a sort of discomfort which is part of this which we get once we just are unconscious followers of this particular scientific method, prevalent scientific method. Now, for example, so in that, so whether it's a naive empiricism, so you can locate it whether it's you believe in naive empiricism. For example, in medieval ages, that empiricism was somehow rooted in the writings of Bible or in Ptolemy's understanding of solar system. And or sophisticated empiricism, where observations from astronomers need to modify an empirical doctrine. So we see here how misguided it is tried to reduce in process Copernican revolution to single principles such as principle of falsification. So empiricism within the domain of why we went from Copernican thing to medieval cosmology to modern cosmology and the Galilean affair. And so the reasons have not been, for example, in Ptolemy's cosmology also you could explain change of seasons and with those epicycles. Why we went to modern cosmology, maybe in some cases the reasons have been more theological, why we got converted into one. So on pure scientific merit, so the debate becomes a bit convoluted. It's not as if we went from this thing was irrational, this Ptolemyal model, which was somehow wedded to medieval cosmologies and an alternative interpretation, and the modern thing was somehow a thing. So that there's a point to it also, which Feyerabend tries to elucidate time and again. Not time and again, he's just elucidating with historical facts. So how can we arrive at, for example, once he says, thus the attempt to retrace the historical origins, the psychological genesis and development, the socio-political economic conditions for the acceptance or rejection of scientific theories, far from being irrelevant for the science standard test, actually leads to criticism of these standards, provided that two domains, historical research and discussion of test procedures, are not apart by fiat. So in the process of trying to just localize or locate or interpret a given fact of history, or even given fact of history, science, the scientific historiography, or how we arrived at something, it has also to be scrutinized via various lenses of sociology, economics, folklore, ideology, theology, religion. It's more than a simple story as it is to be seen, which is Feyerabend is trying to just say. And he's very much astonished like that scholars like Cohen, Poliani, and this consider the distinction as invalid. Maybe other philosophers of science might not take this thing seriously. So, for example, scientific practice does not contain two contexts moving side by side. It is a complicated mixture of procedures, and we are faced by the question if this mixture should be left as it is or it should be replaced by more orderly arrangement. So that's it. So there is more than one part of the story which is going beneath these. So there is not the story. There are many stories, and those stories may be mutually seem to be incompatible. Even if they are incompatible, they might. So, but we should be what I should tolerant to this thing. This is an attitude Feyerabend would want in his promulgation of anarchy of method. So all methods have to be tolerated for the betterment of scientific method or method itself. Not for the betterment, I would say for the so that should be tolerated, or methodology should be tolerated. It will be better for human endeavors. That's the proper thing. Other thing, for example, for example, what kind of things cannot be said represented if the comparison has to be taken within a certain specified and historically well entrenched framework? Means you have to just go through the historiography also. That cannot be discounted. For example, Sumerians, Babylonians, Iranians, Phoenicians, Mycenaeans. So how they practiced science and their totems, beliefs, culture, worship. All things you cannot discount that, and you say that science, what they arrived at was somehow irrespective of, it was devoid of what they believed in or what the practices they had in. You also have to so that is also to be taken, that has not to be discounted as it is discounted by anthropologists or scientific empiricists or a particular understanding of how you practice science. We mod out those non experiences per se. And for example, when we go to physical sciences, for example, it might look normal that we're in those minute elements, if we mod them out, they might not be minute. For example, when he says that in theoretical physics, early 19th century things, the debates when we start of special theory of relativity, the pencil and paper operations of Lorentz and those Einsteinian way of looking, if discern, yet they reflect a major clash of ideologies. So they had the particular ether theory of matter, how they try to locate fields and other things. In those pencil paper differences, they have the implications give major things which is we discern as such to prove his point. So minor differences can lead to minor inferences can lead to different interpretations. So, but it doesn't prove. It does it prove that if we discount. So it can. There should be democracy of ideas. That's right in that spirit. For example, even to prove the same point from physics point of view. For example, differences between Bohr, Dirac, Feynman, and von Neumann suggest that this is more than this. May not exist a single theory, one quantum theory that is used by. For example, in the history of quantum mechanics, people like Dirac, Bohr, Einstein, Heisenberg, they might have arrived at quantum mechanics from matrix interpretation, another from operator approach. So, but there was some unity also to it. Even von Neumann had a mathematical way of interpreting quantum mechanics, and Dirac had its own way. So they had some unity to it. There was some unity to it, but that they arrived at it from different things, different perspectives, different ways of approaching a thing. But what he wants to say, that interpretation, that variety of interpretation has to be allowed. It's like the differences of being Catholic and Protestants. There can be various schools. So just compare Dirac with von Neumann, but they sure are doing different things with them. So that's it. So it's not as if there is a canonical. But interpretation of quantum mechanics that's also true. That's also true. But within scientific empiricism, maybe they might have some consensus. But if we take other interpretations of quantum mechanics like Bohemian quantum mechanics, non-locality, so you can also have interpretations of quantum mechanics which may not have totally scientific, materialistic, causal interpretations which may not necessarily be in consonance with the empirical, the way we define empiricism and scientific empiricism and the methodology which is inspired by that, which is inspired that as a working physicists or quantum physicists would like to have. And in that league, for example, for some people, for example, science is axiomatics plus model theory. So he would say that there should be many ways of doing science, also doing things also. And to just say the same point, for example, and in the bits piece work, mainly the results of Hansen, Kuhn, Leketos, and numerous historians who remained untouched by the positivistic prejudice show that the logician's approach removes not just inessential embroideries of science, but those very features which make scientific progress and thereby science possible. So the work of this Kuhn, so that's the point. So you're just removing that uncomfortable, inessential part, what is essential and what is not essential, while you are practicing a given science, or as a logician, just being crisp and very much rigid to the rules which have been imposed as a game, as the rules of reasoning, and in the process just trying to do away with that thing, the baggage, so which has been validated by these like a task. So maybe he is not. For example, in the domain of science, for example, the domain of logic and the methodology of logic, for example, he even says that the assertion is not clear as there is not single subject logic that underlies all domains. There is Hegel, there is Brouwer, there are logical systems considered by modern constructivists. So in the axiom of middle, maybe in the Brouwerian things, the axiom of this thing, excluded law of excluded middle is not taken as much seriously as other logicians. So in the domain of logic, so he would want to have a diversity of viewpoint. Even if you want to arrive at the same thing, there are multiple ways, and those multiple ways can stem not necessarily from the same thing. They need not to be shown as a parts of some unity, which is otherwise part of scientific methodology or general methodology in logic also. Now, for example, to say that all observers are not led by the same physical evidence to the same picture of universe, unless there are linguist backgrounds are similar or can in a way be calibrated. So the subjectivities of language, culture, which are normally discounted. So science has adopted a new linguistic formulation of old facts, and now that we have become at home in the new dialect, certain traits of old one are no longer binding on us. That's it. The practice of science, as if it's universal, it has absorbed the best elements of all cultures. Maybe in the process it might have just ingested to the different cultures from which it has absorbed those elements. It might have digested them but not assimilated them in the sense of the way Feyerabend would have wanted to. And if it would have assimilated the cultural, the linguistic, the other factors which are part of that thing, that it would have been given to account to. So in that he is demanding the way Kuhan has been there in demanding a historical process as opposed to the epistemological grounding of science. But I still differ from him by opposing the political autonomy of science. Apart from our views, that's my published view. Kuhan as yet by now seems to be almost identical, except they have little sympathy for Kuhn's attempt to tie up history with philosophy. So Kuhan is also maybe sympathetic to what this Feyerabend is trying to just promote or think of. For example, different things which might be relevant in the practice. For example, a powerful tribe invading a country may impose its laws and change the indigenous traditions by force, only to be changed itself by the remnants of the subdued culture. So those latent things which are left as uncomfortable facts, but they might also have a sure role to play in the construction of things, which we miss in how we construct things in our methodology and such. So now what I want to say is that this is what he is trying to say. A free society is a society in which all traditions are given equal rights, equal access to education and other positions of power. So these personal experiences of how he would construct an utopian society in which this thing, which is in consonance with the methodology he is promoting for science, and which is inclusive of all the elements, latent elements of which might have been left. So it's also linked with historical, cultural, latent, and maybe other factors which is there. So for that, a free society does not object to such an attitude, but it will not permit it to become a basic ideology either. So that's what I'm. So what happens? So you have to be. It's not that. So I also argue for contextual account, but again, contextual rules are not to replace the absolute rules; they are to supplement them. So they are to supplement them. So there may be a contextual understanding of things, and there may be some absolute understanding of things. For example, whether he would talk of something called naive anarchist. So if he is an anarchist, so he has talks of anarchism. So a naive anarchist has both absolute rules and context-dependent rules. Or B, all rules and standards are worthless and should be given up. So he is more not converted to the later that there should be no rules, there should be complete anarchy, but there can be rules and there can be contexts where those rules can be somehow made lenient, watered down, or contextualized to the situation we are being forced to, or we are being what we are going to just be faced with. So you have to have, it's not anarchy in that context, it's anarchy which is driven by, or methodology which has to be modified or modeled or factored with regard to the environment, with regard to the problems which are supposed to be there. if the problem is different, so methodology also has not to be that methodology. The faith, unflinching faith in that methodology is not what Feyerabend wants us to just follow. So the adequate description is consistent, and that inconsistent theories may be fruitful and easy to handle, while the attempt to make them conform to the demands of consistency creates usually useless and unwieldy monsters. So the what I should say, the necessity of being consistent, self-consistent, or the virtue of consistency, and the scientific empiricism, which has to be somehow the holy mix of consistency and empiricism, are the essential ingredients of science. So, but there can be inconsistent theories can also exist, which is he's again trying to come to point. One should become not uncomfortable, but should be comfortable that if there are inconsistent facts or inconsistent theories can exist, and you should be uncomfortable that whether they are having an overarching metaphysical unity, which is a part of that science thing that ultimately. So you have not necessarily to be. You have to be open to that. You have to be comfortable with that thing also. So this is what. And for that, for example, he wants to say, for example, for Aristotle, knowledge was qualitative and observational. Today, knowledge is quantitative. So the invocation of number. When we say number, we just dissociate number. We have a quantitative aspect of things. We want to quantify things in terms of numbers and things. So the subjective elements of science which are being left out are there. So we should also not be totally discount the subjective aspects, the qualitative aspects. For example, naturalists approve that by molecular biologists knowledge is qualitative. So that's it. What he's trying to say. That's it. So at the end, what Feyerabend is trying to say is that. So I quote him. He says, "Science is neither a single tradition nor the best tradition there is, except for people who have become accustomed to its presence, its benefits and its disadvantages. In a democracy, it should be separated from state, just as churches are now separated from state." So what is science? What's so great about science? How are you to decide, use sciences who decide that matter? So my answer to the first question is that wide divergences of individuals, schools, historical facts, entire science makes it extremely difficult to identify comprehensive principles, either of a method or a fact. The word science may be a single word, but there is no single entity that corresponds to the word. So what Feyerabend is trying to say, that we should be very much open to how we define science, and the fact that we consider science so great, it's more in popular idiom. So people don't at the altar of science worship beneath there is something which just goes on among public, educated middle class public. It's not entirely something is amiss. And how are we to use sciences, and who decides the matter? So the way. For example, to quote it, he quotes Einstein to say about that human beings are normally deaf to the strongest argument, while they are always inclined to overestimate measuring accuracies. So in the practice of science, sometimes you can be deaf to arguments, and you are maybe more in modern day theories also. You may be more interested in being precise enough to make things to the higher orders of accuracy, to more levels of precision, more orders of precision. For example, and the further fact is the use of religion, for example, the role of religion in science. So here he quotes maybe Pauli, another physicist, that Pauli might have confided to him that in the spirit of Pauli, the unification should be a personal matter. Pauli was deeply concerned about the intellectual situation of Tom, demanded that science and religion again be united together. But for Feyerabend, this enterprise should not be perpetuated by a philosophical, scientific alchemist of mind and imposed by millions on education. You might be sympathetic to the view of Pauli, but how it is to be implemented, so that he might have a different point of view. So, so one important thing is interesting thing which he wants to at the end say, which is a very interesting thing. For example, what he says that physics gets authority from ideas it propagates, but never obeys in actual research. Methodologists play the role of publicity agents, whom physicists hire to praise their results, but whom they would not permit access to enterprise itself. That falsification is not a solution, because very clear in discussion with David Bohm, who gave a Hegelian account of relation between theories. So what he is trying to say that once a historian of the science or philosopher of science, so while he is trying to promote a certain methodology of science, he is being the influence of science or the peculiar enterprise of science which has been successful will allow a particular historian or a philosopher of science to be an appendage to his overall arching scheme of framework without being privy to what is going on. The most sophisticated theories as of now, it may be relevant to me. Maybe the thing is that there are also not enough people who are competent to, not competent, I would say, to know the intricacies of the scientific endeavor, but at least theoretically to be open to how to have an alternative interpretation of the current methodology, even to be sympathetic or to be open to that thing. So they, even the philosopher or the historian of science, they should not be taken as a side kicks or side comment, as a side part of the story. So even to just speak of that method. So for example, when he says at the end, he quotes very interesting: had not Plato observed that written sentences in a book are but transitory stage of a complex process of growth that contains gestures, jokes, asides, emotions, had he not tried to catch this process by means of the dialogue? So when you write a book, so underlying a book, a plot, there may be subplot, there may be something which is going in the background, but in a written prose, those things are really missed off. So what is missed off, or what is there in the larger part of the story, that has not to be if it's in the dialogue, it has not to be modeled out in the same way. In the scientific methodology, we have not to discount the stories, the hidden, the latent part of the story, which we normally mod as part of scientific endeavor. So here I would, to sum up, what I would say is that the way Feyerabend has Feyerabend has opened a way to to be sympathetic to pursue science, not as an end in itself, to pursue science and the scientific method from diverse prisms or from diverse alternative formulations or ideologies, or being tolerant to a scientific methodology which might be inspired necessarily not from the scientific empiricist or the dominant methodology to it. So there may be many ways even to approach to it. So and what has worked in the past, it's not necessarily that it will work in future also. And the historical, cultural, and other contexts, they have not to be also taken into background, and have not necessarily be the theory should not necessarily be fact driven. So the latent elements which are normally discounted in scientific methodologies, that has to be counted in itself. So this was a brief summary of how Feyerabend tried to somehow just try to summarize some of the points of this interesting book against method. Thanks.